much for the welcome this evening, and having seen all three talks, I'm screwed because they're all really exciting and mine's going to be really boring, but hopefully I can get us to the home time fairly efficiently. I have to say as well, I've been very jealous of everyone else's slides, so do enjoy my first one because it's the most exciting slide. I'm not really a scientist. Dave there, he's one of the real scientists at UTS, but I'm in the real science, nice fancy building, and Dave isn't, so there we are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about census and population census, and going to be a slightly different frontier. The frontiers in official statistics are very slow, so I'm going to finish by telling you that I've been at the frontier for quite a few years and we haven't really moved very far. So anyway, never mind. We'll see how we go. So let's just remind ourselves what we all think. I think we probably all know what a census is, but it's a cornerstone of the data that we have on our population, and so the UN defines it as that count or the process of collecting information on your entire population at a specific point in time. So you define your country, the area you want to count, and then you get your information. And it's not just the basic count, it's also a lot of attribute data that we collect. And in some parts of the world, their census really is often the only thing that some countries have that really tell them about their population. And it's not going to be particularly important, but if you do get into doing a census, there are kind of two ways you can count your population. You can either go and try and count people where they usually live, and the UK is an example. Lots of countries do it that way nowadays. The UK is an example of that. That's a great way to do it. It's actually the way you want to produce all your numbers at the other end, but there are issues with it. Some people aren't quite sure where their usual residents are, for example. So Australia still does it on a where you are on census night process, so person present basis, and that means that it's kind of easy to define where you should be counted on census night. It's where you're sleeping that night, but it does mean that you have to walk around the Northern Territories on a Tuesday night in August counting campsites. So there are some logistical issues with doing it that way. It's also technically you can't count people who are overseas on census night, for example. And of course, if you're the ABS in 2016 designing an online census collection system, you might have forgotten to tell the people who designed it that really everybody in Australia lives on the eastern seaboard, and at about 8 o'clock on that evening they're all going to go online and try and do their census form, and that might be an issue for your system. We won't talk about that. A couple of my colleagues were very surprised. They were very annoyed on SAT census night. They said, I can't fill it in. I said, I did mine a week ago. And they said, what's that, some special deal because you work with ABS? I said, no, you could have done it a week ago as well. You were just stupid. Listen to the rules that said do it on census night. Yeah? What does it give us? It gives us the information that we like. I don't know why I thought of Warrenora as a place to look at. That happens to be where I live, and that's why I voted for koalas, because we still have koalas down in the valley in Warrenora. So a fantastic place. But you can go online, obviously, and get this information about our community. So it's really, the census gives us that real information about what's happening. Fred, I didn't start my stopwatch, so I've got no idea how long I've taken. You'll have to tell me when to stop. And then also, building on top of that, it's what actually drives our population estimates on an ongoing basis. So when ABS is producing numbers that tell us how many people are in Australia at a particular time, it's actually based on taking those census numbers and moving them forward. So it's the real basis of everything that we understand about our population. And then, because it's our population-based information, whenever they publish any social survey, so this is the Labour Force survey, one that kind of matters quite a lot, published every month in Australia. When they publish those numbers connect to those numbers, and those numbers are connecting back to your census. And so it's kind of at the bedrock of everything that happens in the population system, certainly for social statistics. And then it's actually in Australia as well. It's very important because it's the basis. The census is also the basis for how the Electoral Commission do redistributions of the population. So in Australia, we have this concept that our electoral system, each area represents the same number of people, and we use the census to drive that. But obviously, there are some issues with it. Only happens every 5. Australia's lucky. because we do it every 5 years here, but most countries do their census on a 10-year cycle. So one of the conversations I had at one point was, where could we get away with doing a census every 10 years? And you're like, well, most countries in the world do, so probably it would be okay, I suspect. But anyway, we do it every 5 years, but then it still takes 1 to 2 years to actually release all the information. So even when the first information comes out from the census, it's actually already effectively out of date by at least a year. They usually aim to get stuff out within about a year. The US has a particular rule where their census is on the 1st of April and they must produce their first numbers on the 31st of December of that year, so that's pretty fast, 8 months. So it's always a little bit out of date. And then of course it becomes less and less relevant. So, I showed you that information for Woronora, but that was on a Tuesday night in August in 2021, and as you can imagine, August 2021 wasn't necessarily the most representative time to see what's going on in your population, because there were 1 or 2 things that were happening in the world at that time that might have made things a bit different. It's a massive logistical exercise. So in a lot of countries, they talk about the census is one of the biggest peacetime operations that the government does. And Australia, the ABS is going to have about 30,000 temporary staff this year to do the census in 2026 to get through those fieldwork operations. So it's a major logistical exercise that it's undertaken. It's expensive. This is not necessarily that expensive in the realms of some things in government, but in government statistics, the census is pretty much the most expensive thing that you do. And so if something around 500 million last time, it'll be more than that this time. It does give you a good, they estimate the return on investment for the economy in terms of what you get back from that data, but it's clearly a very expensive exercise to undertake. Better not have my laptop fall off the thing, that would not be going. And this is kind of important for the entirety of my career, is that the census is not a perfect count of the population. So sometimes I think, people kind of think, we just go out and we count everybody, there we are, that's the information. But it really isn't a perfect count of the population. And that's kind of important when you start to think about what the future could look like, because often people have a very high expectation of how good they think the current thing is. And so when you try and say, well, we could do something a bit different, it's got these problems, they go, I don't want to do that because this thing doesn't have any problems. You go, well, it does actually. This thing has some problems as well. And so this idea that it's a perfect count can actually get in the way of trying to think about what the future could look like, because people have this misunderstanding of really how good the actual thing is. It's very good, don't get me wrong, I'm not here to diss the census and what ABS does, but it's not a perfect count. And in fact, my whole PhD and then the career happened, because basically the UK made a bit of a mess up in 1991. I am that old. And so in 1991, they kind of screwed up the census. They lost 1 million people. That's kind of bad. You don't want to do that really if you're doing a census. In fact, actually, the loss of the 1 million people wasn't really the issue in the census. What actually was the issue was them not recognising that they'd lost 1 million people, and that was the real problem. So the census published their results and said, what a fantastic job we'd done. Another organisation had to go and actually calculate the population estimates and went, whoopsie daisy, we've lost 1 million people. And there was just one problem with that, really, that those two groups of people in the same organisation. So it would have been helpful if they'd talked to each other really before they'd released the numbers, and then they wouldn't have got themselves into such a mess with it. Because really the issue was this idea that it was perfect, when in fact clearly there was an issue with coverage. But the coverage wasn't that bad. It's quite common to lose 2-3% in a census. That's kind of the amount that you tend to lose. So it wasn't so much the million, it was more a lack of understanding and recognition of missing it. And so how do we get around that? Well, we then follow the census with a large-scale coverage survey or post-enumeration survey, and then we try and estimate for those that we've missed or incorrectly counted by the census operations. And in the UK, certainly where I did my early work, when I say large scale, the census is the biggest data collection exercise that the Office for National Statistics does. The coverage survey that they do 3-4 weeks later is the second biggest data collection exercise that they do. So these are big surveys. We're talking 300,000 households in England and Wales, so more like 400,000 in the whole UK. I thought I'd better put something in that made it look like a new statistic, so I shoved these slides in, which I had from somewhere else. So how does this work? Actually, it's a thing called dual system estimation, and environmental people are very familiar with this as well, because it's a cool way of estimating all sorts of populations when you can't easily count them. The 1949 date, that's Secker and Deming, and they implemented this in India, and that's probably the real first human population example. And so here's the idea. You start off, you count some people, you have one crack at doing it, you get the total of the people on that list. You then have another crack at doing it, and you need to link between the two counts. So that's why it's often called capture, recapture, or mark. Capture, mark, recapture. So you mark people. Humans don't like being stamped when they fill in their census forms, so you have to kind of do it by matching people. But you work out who's been counted twice, who's been counted only once, and then you do a bit of magic in the corner there, and you work out the total. And anyone in the room who's ever done, and because it was mentioned that statistics is everywhere, you will have all done a chi-square test of independence, and therefore you'll notice the formula in the corner is just me taking a chi-square test of independence and whipping it around to turn around what I have as in my formula. Of course, it doesn't just happen by accident. You need to have a closed population, you need to be able to link between things. You need independence between captures for an individual. That's kind of hard to get in a lot of human populations. You need independence across individuals, but like all good statistical techniques, we don't usually worry about that too much. It just screws up the standard error, but bootstrapping will take care of all that for you. And then homogeneous capture probability for one of the captures, there's a lot of work in how you make it so that you think these assumptions will actually hold. And the Census Bureau, they really were the first people in the 1980s who thought about doing this with census. And the idea, of course, is that you don't get to do a complete attempt at counting the population twice. That would be really expensive. The survey is only going to a sample, so you actually have to estimate these quantities and then use those estimates of quantities to actually get the total. Okay, back to thinking about what we can do with administrative data to improve things. So I want to take you through, these are things that are actually currently happening. So I want to take you through 4 ways that we're currently using administrative data to make the census more efficient, and then also just finish by thinking a little bit what that future could look like if we could replace the census with administrative data. So first thing, when we think about the census logistics, even back in 2011 when I was in Australia visiting, I had to do the census in 2011 because I was visiting. And in fact, it was still literally someone, I was in a halls of residence in the University of Wollongong, somebody came and shoved a form under my door, said, please send this, fill it in, I'll be back in 3 days. Or you could do it online. I did it online because I wanted to keep the form as a memento, but they were still done in a very traditional way. And one of the most important ways that we've improved logistics is simply about how we find dwellings to go and ask people to complete the census. And so nowadays we're constructing address lists to use that to enhance that delivery. We get forms. Most of us on census night this time won't get a form. We won't see a person. We'll get a letter with a code that says, go online, fill this out. We'll never bother you again. And so many people will just do it that way. Because census in Australia is a person-present census, one of the issues is about whether the household is vacant, absent on census night. Because you don't want to spend lots of time going back repeatedly to a household to try and get a response when there's actually nobody there. So again, using administrative data to understand it, they're working with electricity data to understand whether people are actually in that house on census night. And if they can get to the smart meter data, you may actually be able to tell the difference between a dwelling that's actually vacant for a long period of time versus a dwelling which really is usually occupied but genuinely has nobody there on census night, and therefore you don't need to get a count from it. There's also the non-household population, people in prisons, hospitals, hotels, campsites. Admin data is starting to be very helpful for that, because a lot of these organisations know roughly who they have. if you as a start, although in 1991 it turned out that the Ministry of Defence in the UK didn't actually know where their armed forces were on census night, but that was then, and this is now. I'm sure they know now. And this is also very important now. It's also this issue around internet. It's all very well to send out lots of letters to people and ask them to do it on the internet. You need to have understanding, and you might think, well, it's going to be everywhere, but of course, internet usage and uptake isn't everywhere, and there are still certain areas where they will not do that. They will be out in the field with forms because they know that the internet coverage is poor, internet uptake is poor in those areas. How can we use it to improve coverage? This is some work where I've seen some of the work. So, in fact, in Statistics New Zealand have already done this in 2018 and 2023. Because their actual census count wasn't as good as they wanted, they actually inserted a Ministry of Records into their census database and called them census responses. They didn't just do any admin records, they had very high confidence about their quality and so on, but they basically used those administrative records to enhance the census, particularly in areas where the count had been lower than they wanted. Matching is a big issue with all these things. I'm not going to talk about matching, but matching is really a big issue because we don't have ID numbers to match on, so actually doing high quality matching is a whole issue in itself. And then some work that I did when we were looking at the 2022 census in Scotland was we used it to enhance the coverage survey. So they had lower response than they wanted in the census. They had much lower response than they wanted in the coverage survey. So we used it to improve the coverage survey response. But again, you have to have that high confidence in those records and see that the household was non-responding from the coverage survey. We can do it to do things, and they're doing it to do things to improve the quality of the census. And I'm using quality now. Different coverage is also obviously an aspect of the quality of the census. But thinking about actually when you look at the numbers and you see them, the quality of them. And one of the things that they do now is they use it to improve imputing the households. So in the census, if the enumerator would walk down the street and was convinced somebody was there who refused to do the form, then the office would typically impute a household in to replace that household in the actual census database. And so being able to use administrative data gives you a much stronger way of working out what type of household you think you should put there, because you've got some information about that household from the administrative information. And then also, we often fill in on at least some variables we impute when individuals don't respond to that question. And certainly in Stats New Zealand, they've been doing some direct replacement for particular records and particular variables where an individual doesn't respond, and they use an administrative value in replace of that. Or you can use it to guide your donor system. So you go looking for a donor that has similar administrative records. That's what National Records Scotland were doing. And the last one is, and this I just took this off the census of the website here. This is what ABS did with the income data. So they enhanced the census income data by matching in administrative data. So they're adding information into the census, traditional census. So instead of asking you lots and lots of questions about your income, they only ask us one very simple question, and then they were linking in information to enhance that. And then, of course, one of the issues that comes whenever you use administrative data is this point down the bottom here about being very careful about the privacy and the rules on which you can use this information. Okay, so just to finish, though, what's the future? What can we do with our census replacement? So I think, just to start with, this is about as cool as my slides get. What is a census? And I like to think of a census in one dimension. It's this really long database. You're just counting every single person with a few basic demographics about that person and where they're located. And in our case, like 28 million records long. But a census is also quite a wide database because it has lots of attributes in it. It actually collects a lot of other information about individuals, like their education, health, employment, our background, and so on. And the point is that when you start thinking about the future of the census, at the moment, those two things come from the same product. We go out and we count people, and we just ask them whatever we want. And it turns out, of course, if you're going to send 30,000 people around Australia to count the long database, you might as well ask them a few extra questions while you're there as well, and that doesn't actually cost that much extra compared to the actual other process. But we don't have to do those two things together. So we can think about, can we use different approaches to achieve those two goals? Can we separate out the idea of having to create that long part from the wide part and do those using different approaches? So about that long component, well, in fact, there are quite a few countries in the world who already don't go out and count everybody to do that long component. So a fair few countries in the world have population registers, and they use those as the basis for their population counts. The Nordic countries have very integrated register-based systems for their social statistics. They've been doing it for a long time. A country like Netherlands has a national population register infrastructure. It doesn't have as much stuff on it as the Nordic countries, but it has that register. And then Italy is, I think, quite a nice example. It's a bit closer to Australia because they do have population registers, but they tend to be operated at a local level. So to create a national register, you've got to collect everything together. And that creates for them more issues with people being not on the right register at the right time, for example. And even for the Nordic countries, that's one of the biggest issues, is people get on the register when they arrive, but they often don't leave the register when they leave. The problem is, of course, in Australia, we don't have a population register. I wasn't here for the Australia card, but I understand that it's still burned into the psyche of anybody who was in Australia at that time, and therefore the people just come at the idea of a population register and ID cards. Everyone just comes out in a rash, and it's just not going to happen. But Australia's not unique in that. A lot of countries don't have these population registers. So how can we construct that, a register, create a population spine, if you like, from other administrative data? And in fact, in Australia, ABS already has something that looks a bit like that. It's called PLIDA, the Person Level Integrated Data Asset, and they've created that by linking together Medicare, tax, and Centrelink to create an individual record file that they can add other information on. And if you want to do research, you can go and use that. The trouble is that's obviously it's not designed to be a perfect count of the population, so there's a lot of work still to think about how you actually measure the coverage of that, how you measure its errors, because you know it's not going to be perfect, but how do you measure its errors? And in fact, ISTAT, the Italian people, have done quite a lot of work on that because their population register is not so great when they put it together. How about the detailed attributes? Well, there actually are countries that have gone the full ball. So they have their registers, they have everything on those registers, and they produce their entire census from a register-based system. And yeah, that's a lot of information because these countries are all in the EU, so they all have the statistics police called Eurostat who go around and tell them everything they have to do. So they really have a lot of information in their admin data. A lot of other countries, they're doing some kind of hybrid thing, so they're using their registers to get the long count, but then they're using surveys to fill out all the extra information. And in the US, they kind of separated these two things completely. They still have the long form census every 10 years. It's in their constitution, so they have to have it. But in the meantime, they have this very large rolling survey called the American Community Survey, and that's really how they provide most of that more detailed information on a rolling basis rather than as a long form. And there we go, that shows you for these are European countries, how it's moved over the 2000, 2010 and the 2020 rounds with more and more countries using more and more data. But I think New Zealand are probably the most interesting for us because they are now, look like they're going to really be a country moving to a hybrid model without a population register. New Zealand doesn't have a population register, the same as us, but they're going to produce their own spine, and that's going to become the basis of their system with a lot of surveys operating on it. And that's the idea, of course, is it's just this dual system thing now, but you've got the spine and then you're measuring with the survey. It's just that you might want to try and use the survey to do the attributes at the same time as it's doing the coverage. And then this is an example of work from Ireland, which again, they're putting their system together with administrative data. So what is the future for census? So it is a slow change in official statistics. They don't rush to do anything. So in census in 2026, it'll be quite traditional. There'll be lots of things in the background actually which are different, but to you it might look a little bit the same as the last couple really. You'll get a letter, you'll do the form online, and it won't look that different. I think part of the reason, in fact, that they're not changing is because of a positive COVID effect, in the sense that doing a census in 2021 August was quite easy because everybody was at home and they didn't have anything else to do. So you asked them to do the form and they said, oh, thank God, there's something to do in an evening. So they got a very, very good count in 21. I'm nervous for them in 26. If you look at censuses that happened close to COVID but not in that COVID window, New Zealand struggled in 2018. They struggled again in 2023. Scotland in 22. So you might think, what's going on there? The UK actually, as anyone knows, is 4 different countries who all play together, roughly speaking. And so when it comes to census, we actually have 4 separate censuses. We usually choose to do them all on the same day. But in 2021-22, Scotland decided to go a year later, and boy, did they regret it. So, but they had poorer coverage, not really bad coverage, but in a census, when you're 2 or 3 percentage points underneath the competition, and if you're Scotland, England and Wales is the competition, then it's bad news. The UK, they've been thinking about this stuff for ages. So before I came to Australia, I was working with them on the Beyond 2011 programme. That was going to be the programme to replace. So you can tell we've gone way beyond 2011 and we haven't replaced the census yet. So that was their programme in around 2011 to replace the census. They had another one of those programmes in the mid-20s, which has finished now, with the article headlines up in the corner there, plans to replace 2031 census in England, Wales, set to be abandoned after backlash. So the frontier's not moving forward very quickly. But I think New Zealand might really end up leading the way here because they're really being pushed forward. And of course, much of this is driven, in this case, by a political decision in New Zealand to say we will not have a traditional census in the future. That probably wasn't really a decision made by the statisticians, it was a decision made by the politicians to say this is the way we're going to go, and therefore this is, you need to make that happen. And just to finish, a little bit of shameless self-promotion. This is a little paper that I wrote with a colleague from ABS just recently around thinking about that census transformation and the future of population statistics. So that's my finish. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope I didn't take up too much discussion time.